Hello, my name is Grace Hayek, and on behalf of the Glencoe Public Library, I welcome you to our webinar, Climate Change and the North Shore. We are honored to have with us today climate scientist Don Wuebbles, who's joining us from Urbana, Illinois, and Francine Vandenbrandler, joining us from Zurich, Switzerland. Today's presentation is a partnership between the library, the Glencoe Sustainability Task Force, Go Green Wilmette, and the Friends of the Green Bay Trail. Our special thanks go to Barney Gallagher of the Sustainability Task Force. It was his initiative that set the wheels in motion for this program to happen. Significant in-kind support has been provided by John Anderson and Katie DeMuro of Greenleaf Communities, a Chicago-based nonprofit organization advancing applied research for a healthy and sustainable world. Greenleaf recruits and organizes multidisciplinary teams to provide solutions concerning the health and well-being of society. Additional sponsors include the Glencoe League of Women Voters and the public libraries of Chillicothe, Downers Grove, Highland Park, Lake Villa, Morton Grove, Northbrook, Wheaton, and Winnetka. Thank you all for your contributions to this event. This program is being recorded and will be placed on the Glencoe Library's YouTube channel. Everyone who registered for this program will receive a link to the recording within a day or two by email. If you have a question for the presenters, you are invited to enter it into the Q&A at any time during the program. Some of you have already submitted questions when you registered. Toward the end of the program, I will ask as many questions as we have time for on your behalf. Please use the chat function only to reach us if you're having technical trouble, and we will do our best to help you. Please put your questions for the presenters into Q&A, not chat. Closed captions are enabled for those who want them. You can turn them on or off at any time using the CC Live Transcript button or the More menu. Now we're going to run a quick 2-question poll to help us learn how many of you are out there watching and where you're located. Great, thank you very much. Following our program, you'll see a short survey asking for your comments. We do read all the responses and would appreciate any feedback that you would like to share. Today's program will begin with an overview of current climate change research from the global perspective. Then it will narrow the focus to regional and local effects and conclude with solutions. Dr. Wuebbles will walk us through the slides and discuss them with Dr. Vandenbrandler. At the end of their presentation, they will take questions. Now I'll introduce our speakers. Dr. Donald J. Wuebbles recently transitioned to being an emeritus professor of atmospheric science at the University of Illinois. He is also the director of the Center for Urban Resilience and Environmental Sustainability across the University of Illinois system. He was assistant director with the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the Executive Office of the President in Washington, D.C., where he was the White House expert on climate science from 2005 to early 2017. He was head of the Department of Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Illinois from 1994 to 2006. Prior to this, he was a group leader at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Dr. Wuebbles is an expert in atmospheric physics and chemistry with over 500 scientific publications related to the Earth's climate, Earth quality, and the stratospheric ozone layer. His leadership in international and national scientific assessments includes being a coordinating lead author on several international climate assessments led by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, that resulted in IPCC being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. He co-led the first volume of the 4th U.S. National Climate Assessment published in November 2017 that assessed the science of climate change and its effects on the U.S. He led an assessment on the impacts of climate change on the Great Lakes that was published in March 2019 and co-led a special assessment on the impacts of climate change on the state of Illinois published in May 2021. Dr. Wuebbles will be joined in conversation by Francine Vandenbrandler, who leads climate and water research and policy analysis at Greenleaf Communities. She is also a postdoctoral researcher at the Swiss Institute for Aquatic Research and Technology, investigating how nature-based solutions can make cities more resilient in the face of climate change. Currently based in Switzerland, she completed her dissertation for the University of Amsterdam on metropolitan water governance and recently co-authored a report by the United Nations on green and just cities. Dr. Wuebbles and Dr. Vandenbrandler, thank you so much for your time today. I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you much, Grace. So I'll go ahead and get my presentation going. Yeah. And hopefully everyone can see that. If there's any issues, please do let me know. So what I'm going to do is, as Grace said, is kind of give you an overview of the science and what it means to Illinois, people in Illinois, and our surrounding region. And it's useful to know that every year there's about 12,000 papers or more, actually, that are published in the peer-reviewed science literature by scientists that look at how and why our climate is changing. And as a result, various governments around the world, including the United Nations, have pulled together the scientists at various times to assess what all that means and to kind of summarize, what the state of understanding is. The latest IPCC report came out a few months ago. The next volume 2, which is on the impacts on people around the world, is coming out next month. And the third volume will come out a few months later, relating to potential policy actions. And so, so Grace already mentioned all these different assessments. The picture of the Climate Science Special Report is the National Climate Assessment that I led in 2017. And then we have the Great Lakes Assessment that was published a couple years ago. And you'll see a little later the Illinois assessment. So what do all these assessments tell us? They give a very common message, because that's what the science tells us, that our climate is changing here in Illinois and throughout the world. It's happening now. It's happening extremely rapidly, and that's a major point. Our climate is changing about 10 times more rapidly than nature tends to change it. And that's why this is such a major issue for the people of Illinois and the people of the world and all the other life around us, because it's changing so rapidly, it's not possible for us to adapt quickly enough to totally prevent issues with that. So that's part of what we have to respond to. It's not just about temperature change. It's not just, quote, global warming, as the media's like to call it in the past. It's really the all aspects of a changing climate, of climate change. Really of concern is that severe weather is generally becoming more intense. And we'll talk about some of that and what it means, particularly to those of us here in the Midwest. Sea levels are rising and oceans are being affected. I won't talk about that today because we're going to concentrate on the Midwest, but it's a major issue with coastal areas throughout the world. Why is this happening? It's largely happening because of human activities and associated pollution. We'll touch on that. And the climate will continue to change over the coming decades. So we're not going to totally prevent this, but how much it changes really does depend on us. We can determine just how much further changes we see and what impacts those have on us. And so that's a major message in this whole thing. So now, from the latest IPCC report, as I said, it came out in November. One of the statements is climate change is already affecting every region on Earth in multiple ways. The changes we experience will increase with further warming, very similar to the kind of message I just gave you. One of the things it noted is that the recent changes are unprecedented in many thousands of years, largely outside the experience of humanity. So the carbon dioxide concentrations that are a major driver of these changes, for example, haven't been this high in at least 2 million years. And that was a much, much warmer Earth, by the way, than we have now. And back then it was due to various natural reasons, but we can go into if you want to. That's not what is happening now. The sea level rise is the fastest rate of change in at least 3,000 years. Arctic sea ice areas at lowest level in at least 1,000 years. And glacier retreats are unprecedented in at least 2,000 years. So the things we're seeing are really outside of the experience of when most of the humans have been on this planet. If we look at the change happening globally, we've seen on the order of a 2-degree change I'm sorry, a little over 1 degree change in temperature in centigrade, over 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit from the period from about 19,001 to 2019. And the last 2 years have been very, very warm as well. 2020 and 2016 are tied for the warmest years on record. 2021 is going to end up in probably second or third warmest years. So this last decade, in fact, has been the warmest decade on record. So if you look at the temperatures in the top graph, those are really based on observations made throughout the world, many, many thousands of observations made with thermometers throughout the world, very carefully evaluated and analyzed. And we've seen very significant changes over the last 50 years. Now, if we take that temperature record and put it on top of information we have going back further based on proxies for temperature, tree rings, you probably have heard of, but there's many, many other types of data that we use. This is for the Northern Hemisphere. And what it shows is that those most recent temperatures are way above temperatures we've seen since the time of Christ as a planet. And yet, if you looked at that temperature record, you'd see the medieval warm period when Vikings were in southern Greenland and established colonies there. And you'd also see the Little Ice Age when it was extremely cold in North America and Europe, and yet we don't see anything like what we're seeing now in recent decades in terms of the temperature change. If we look at the planet as a whole and go back to look at the recent changes relative to the 1951 to 1980 period, we see particularly that almost all places in the world are warming. There's a few exceptions. We can talk about those. I won't go into much detail about that today, though. But one of the things you really do see is that the Arctic region is especially warming, and that the land masses are warming more than the oceans. So when I talk about that 1.8 degrees, that's over the entire planet. So in fact, over the land masses of North America, we're seeing something much larger than that. I also mentioned that, extreme events is what we're really concerned about, that and sea level rise for the coastal areas. And so the kind of things we're seeing is that really warm days are getting more common. As a result, heat waves are generally increasing. We have multiple days above at a very high temperature that are unusual, hard to deal with, particularly if they're at uncomfortable levels, say above 100 degrees for us here in the Midwest. And so that is happening. Cold waves generally are decreasing. Doesn't mean we don't have cold days, we do. Particularly if we get, because of the weakening in the jet stream, we get these strong events from the Arctic sending cold air down to us and sometimes further south, like we had in Texas last year, where they had major problems with power as a result. Those are related to the weakening of the jet stream and is actually related to the changes occurring in climate because of all that warming that's going on in the Arctic. One of the big findings that affect us and much of the world is that more precipitation is coming as larger events. What the graph on the right side shows for the top 1% events, we've seen over a 40% increase in such really large, in the top 1% of events in the Midwest here. So that is, it's clearly seen. When I talk to farmers, they get it. They're noticing that in their fields, particularly when they try to get their crops in the spring. We tend to have more of an issue with large precipitation. I'm a farm boy from Southern Illinois when growing up, and actually went to Illinois as a student as well. Never expected to come back here as a professor, but did eventually. Because of that increase in precipitation, we're seeing more risk of floods. particularly in the Midwest and the Northeast, where we're getting these really large changes in extreme precipitation events. And we're seeing an increased intensity of droughts in certain parts of the world, particularly in the Southwest and Southeast, in looking at us here in the United States. And as a result, because of the warming, drier conditions in the West, we're particularly seeing an increase in large wildfires as a result. We're also seeing an increasing intensity of hurricanes, and expect more of that in the future. All these things are expected to continue. Tornado activity is much more variable. Won't go into the details of tornadoes today, but we are seeing an increase in outbreaks like the one we had in December that caused so much harm here in the Midwest, and actually was one of the what I'll call billion-dollar events here for the United States, and I'll talk about that in a minute. In fact, that's the next slide. So since 1980, NOAA's been tracking the billion-dollar events. We've seen over $2.1 trillion in effects from severe weather events on the US economy over the last 40 years, sorry. When they started doing this in 1980, we would have a couple such events every year. Now we're seeing typically 20 or more such events. Actually, in 2021, we just completed, we had 20 such events. Now these account for inflation, so it's not just due to the monetary increase. This is really because severe weather is getting more severe. Now, as we go, and it's affecting all parts of the country, by the way. Going back to the IPCC assessment, it states it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change, making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts, more frequent and severe. Again, in agreement with the kind of things I just said about us here. Well, what is causing climate change? I've already mentioned the human activities, particularly the burning of fossil fuels and our land use change has been the primary drivers. But there are many lines of evidence demonstrating that human activities, especially the emissions of greenhouse gases come from the burning of these fossil fuels and land use change, are primarily responsible for the observed climate changes. For the period extending over the last century, there are no credible alternative explanations. It's very clear in the science. It's not the sun. Actually, the sun has actually decreased slightly in its output, not increased. Nonetheless, if you look at blogs online, you'll see all the time, I was like, oh, it's just natural, it's just the sun, or we'll give some other reason without ever showing you the science behind it. But I can tell you the sun output was measured very carefully from satellites for a number of years now, and very clearly has been decreasing slightly, if not, certainly not increasing. It's not natural cycles. There's no natural cycles that explain what we have. In fact, the only explanation, if we look at the observed temperature record in the right-hand graph, and this is from the latest IPCC assessment, is that that nature cannot explain the observed changes. The only thing that explains the changes we've seen since the 1960 or so time period is the effects of human activities and the increase in those greenhouse gases and certain particles in the atmosphere as well. Now, the way that scientists look at the future is to develop scenarios for how are humans going to continue to use those fossil fuels or make land use change that might further drive increases in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, one of those key gases that is changing as a result of human activities. In fact, that's probably the single most important one, but there's others like methane and nitrous oxide and several others. So we analyze scenarios for under given conditions for each of those. Are we going to continue heavily using fossil fuels? And that would be the high scenario here, the one in the dark red. Or are we going to transition away fairly rapidly to alternative fuels and for energy and transportation, in which case you get something more like the yellow one? Or are we going to make policies that say we really want to keep this below 2 degrees and perhaps aim at 1.5 degrees centigrade change? And that's those are goals established by the United Nations framework, all the roughly 200 countries in the world coming together, making the decision that that should be the goal, as part of the Paris Agreement. And that would require the light blue to get 1.5 degrees. The next one higher that says 2.6 on it would actually be into getting 2 degrees centigrade. So all those scenarios then result in a range of temperatures. All the different models we use are the Earth's climate systems that try to represent all the physics and chemistry and biology affecting the Earth, are used to then look at that. They all have a little bit different assumptions about the things that we don't know very well. For example, how will the biosphere respond to certain changes? And as a result, they end up with a range of different effects. The largest scenario is going to put you close to 5 degrees centigrade. Now you say 5 degrees centigrade, doesn't sound like much. Well, if you consider this is annually averaged, globally averaged, the last ice age was roughly 5 degrees centigrade colder than now. And yet we had thousands of feet of ice under us in the Midwest here. So very different than the kind of climate we know now. And so 1 degree change, like we've already seen globally, is in fact very important. And a 5 degree change would really be dramatically different kind of climate. Even 1.5 degrees, if we could achieve that, which I have my doubts about, would be quite a bit different climate than humans have experienced. Now, if we look at those different types of scenarios and just say, well, we've seen about a 1 degree change at this point, centigrade. What if we have 1.5 or 2 degrees or going up to 4 degrees, not even quite the highest scenario? We're going to see dramatic differences across the planet, particularly over land and at high latitudes. And so again, it's much more warming, but it's not just all about warming. It's really what happens then also to extreme events. If you looked at precipitation patterns under the different scenarios are similar. Generally, the dry get drier and the warm get warmer. I mean, the wet get wetter. And so for those of us in the Midwest here, generally we expect increases in precipitation. Now, if I tune in Illinois, exactly what you'll see is that generally, yes, we do expect an increase in precipitation, but more of it coming in winter and spring, fall, and actually a drying in the summer. And as a son of a farmer, that's a concern to those of us who are involved in agriculture. So I mentioned the Illinois assessment. So Jim Angel and I put together a team of about 45 scientists from around the state and elsewhere, mostly in the state of Illinois, that examined how the state of Illinois is changing and how it might continue to change in the future. The Nature Conservancy agreed to publish this for us. It's readily available on their website. If you want a hard copy, though, I can certainly send you one. I have a few left, but you can clearly get it off of their website. If you have any trouble, let me know. So if we look at the Illinois and the surrounding states, we can expect that climate will continue to change, but that we've already have seen changes. We've seen something similar to what's happening globally, about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit increase over the last century plus, going back to early 1900s. And that most of that change has occurred in the recent decades. Now, as we go forward, looking at those scenarios, I'm going to show you the high emission scenario, which is that high case I showed you previously, and a low emissions case, which is I think it was the yellow one, it was kind of the middle low case. And it's kind of the one I think is probably going to end up being the most realistic. That there's dramatic differences, not so much by mid-century. Mid-century, there's small differences between the two scenarios, but by the end of the century, there's very, very large differences. So as we look forward for Northern Illinois, for example, you can see on the left that there's dramatic differences in the two scenarios by the end of the century, and we're talking in some cases, 3 or 4 degrees versus 7 or 8 degrees in the higher scenario. Now, I also mentioned that extremes would be affected. So this is annual hottest maximum temperature. We can expect to see by mid-century more days over 100 degrees in northern Illinois than we've ever had in the past, by far. And then that's going to continue to grow depending on which of those scenarios we follow, which of those emission scenarios we follow. And so the top shows the maximum temperature, the bottom shows the 5-day maximum temperature, so an average over 5 days. And again, you expect more heat waves is what that bottom one says. Now, what about days above 95 degrees? That's for things like corn, that's really important, but even humans tend to respond to conditions when it starts getting above 95 degrees. And again, we expect a significant increase in the number of days, such that by the end of the century, we could be talking about most of the summer being above 95 degrees, depending on which scenario we follow. And at the same time, the number of days below freezing are likely to decrease dramatically in both cases, as much as a month, even by mid-century. Looking at precipitation, I've already told you the story that we expect to continue increase in the amount of precipitation in Illinois overall. But if we look at seasonal rainfall, this is for northern Illinois. And if you want to see other parts of Illinois, you go to the assessment, you can see all of that. The largest increases occur in winter and spring, and overall a drying in the summer. Not as much in northern Illinois as actually in central Illinois, but overall a slight decrease in precipitation in the summer. And on top of that, warmer temperatures, drier soils because of evaporation, et cetera. More of that rainfall is likely to come as larger events, just as we've already been seeing, and that's going to continue to grow. So if we looked at the days above of precipitation of 2 inches or more, that's likely to continue to grow throughout the century. The first two being the high and low emission scenarios for mid-century, and then the last two on the graph showing you the same for the late century. And so we can expect more and more precipitation to become as larger events as we go through the century. And we're talking climate time scales, because we're not talking year to year. Some years are going to be lower than others, but overall, we're seeing to expect these changes. Well, as you all know, the North Shore is particularly highly susceptible to flooding. This just shows some analyses suggesting the susceptibility to that and some of the past events that show that with this increase in precipitation coming as larger events, that the North Shore particularly is going to be threatened by that, and something that needs to be considered as you look at being more resilient and adapting to the changes occurring in the climate system. If we look at urban regions in a more general sense, the high temperatures and heat waves cause poor air quality, harms public health, especially for the vulnerable. The heat itself can be a major cause of health issues, but on top of that, it tends to drive poor air quality, which further adds to the issue. The projected increases in extreme precipitation will likely exacerbate flooding, as I've already shown you. And there are also going to be many other types of impacts, threatening drinking water quality and putting stress on the water infrastructure in the area, and how one deals with that and adapts to those changes that are expected. If you look at public health, this is from the Illinois assessment. Expect a number of the changes in temperature and precipitation, et cetera, are all likely to lead to more concerns for public health, particularly things like viruses and bacteria being affected. West Nile disease, et cetera, likely to increase and become worse issues. And for people like me that have bad allergies, the lengthening pollen season is not so great either. Looking at water resources, I've already mentioned some of these issues associated with flooding and droughts and water quality and how that could affect water issues in Illinois. If you look at the Chicago region, different areas have different ways of different responses to extreme water, and we're going to have to be able to adapt to those regions in different ways, probably to what is happening there as we look at what's likely to happen over the decade. Agriculture, we already know that severe weather has a major impact on agriculture. We tend to get the lowest yields when we have major droughts or heat waves or sometimes extreme precip, which kind of drowns the field in some cases. And so if you look over time, we've been seeing an increase in corn and soybean yields, largely because of genetic changes being made in the plants. But when there's extreme weather, we still tend to get significant decreases. Now, what this doesn't deal with, what is we get more extreme compounded events in the future, more heat waves combined with droughts, et cetera, that leads to even larger issues. And it's something that is actively being studied right now. The thing ends up that insects and weeds love the increase in carbon dioxide and the increase in temperature. And so they're likely to be larger problems they've been in the past. And we also have to be worried about livestock. The increased heat stress, reduced forage quality can all be important as we look forward and how we adapt again to these changes occurring in climate. In the assessment, we also looked at the impacts on the Illinois ecosystem. The rates of climate change are much more rapid in the past, affecting ecosystems in various ways. And you know, some plants are going to do better than others as we look forward to the future. And plants and species of various sorts, animals as well. But so some trees are likely to benefit. I showed this at a meeting in Southern Illinois, and somebody mentioned sweet gums. It was a mayor from a town in Central Illinois, just South Central Illinois, and he said that sweet gums are the bane of his existence, and I understand why. They create such a mess, but they like the increase in climate, the changing climate. They like the warmer weather, but some of the things we've had traditionally are not going to like it as well. And the assessment goes through almost every major species of tree. Was an analysis done by a very famous biologist that was especially done for the Illinois assessment. So please take a look at that if you're interested. At the same time, we can expect to have more concerns with undesirable species and things moving north into Illinois that weren't here before, and various types of invasives. On top of that, aquatic areas are likely to, because of the reduction in ice cover, the warmer water, et cetera, likely to have more issues as well. You know, and it's important to recognize that climate change does interact with and amplifies impacts of other stresses. So ecosystems that are already stressed will be even less resilient. Now, if we look at the Great Lakes, you know, something that's been of great concern, particularly the North Shore, has been the high lake levels in recent years, and now, you know, it's declined again now. A lot of that depends on what rainfall is coming into the Great Lakes Basin, and if years when we have more of that extreme rainfall are likely to lead to higher lake levels. Other years, like we've had this last year, when it's didn't have as much issues with extreme rainfall this last year, we're likely to, you know, decrease again. So we do think that the lake levels are going to continue to fluctuate like they have in the past, but we could have more issues with high lake levels than we've had as well. And we're still trying to understand just what that means. Actually, I'm trying to do modeling studies right now to kind of prepare that we can do a more thorough analysis of the Great Lakes in the next 3 or 4 years. So changes in weather and climate conditions will stress physical infrastructure in the lakes as well, and in the region. And something already mentioned a lot of this, but things like even roads and sewers need to be considered as we look at the changes occurring in the climate. Now, if we look at again at the IPCC assessment, one of its statements is there's no going back from some changes in the climate system. However, some changes could be slowed and others could be stopped by limiting the warming. What can we do? Well, we basically have three options. We can mitigate, take measures to reduce the magnitude of the emissions that are driving these changes in climate. We can adapt. We can take measures to reduce the adverse impacts. We can become more resilient, or we can suffer. And right now we've been doing a little of all three, particularly suffering. To minimize suffering for the future, that can only be achieved by doing a lot of mitigation and a lot of adaptation. The Paris Agreement was signed in December 2015 while I was at the White House, and results in the first agreement by all the countries, basically all the countries of the world, to try to do something about climate change. The near-term goals were not sufficient to achieve an awful lot. The long-term goal was to get to 2 degrees or less, as I already mentioned, and particularly aim at 1.5 degrees. And I think that still is the goal and something we should still aim at, but it's getting progressively more difficult to achieve the 1.5 degrees, and maybe even get to be too difficult to achieve the 2 degrees centigrade goal. The COP26 meeting was held in Glasgow a few months ago, and it particularly was aimed at keeping the warming to 1.5 degrees, and it wasn't totally successful. Countries did try to do more than they've done with the original Paris Agreement in terms of trying to improve what they're going to offer to do and try to phase down things like coal, but the timelines are not so clear, and we're lagging the ability to really get to net zero emissions by 2050, which is what we have to achieve if we're going to hold the warming to 1.5 degrees. It's going to be really difficult, but possible yet. I don't want to be totally negative about that.
Don, we're at the 30-minute mark now.
Great. I got maybe 5 more minutes to go, and then we can go into questions. So the current policies are consistent with the, not the highest scenario, but the next highest scenario, SSP 7.0, which is the countries have agreed to start reducing their emissions by 2030, or see certain reductions by 2030. We're going to need much larger changes, though, if we're going to do anything approaching that net zero. And so there's a lot to be done yet if that's going to happen. And that's true even to achieve the 2 degrees. Essentially, we're going to have net zero by 2063 or so to achieve 2 degrees centigrade. So there's a lot to be done. The world has begun the transition, I think, of its energy and transportation systems, but now it's moving very, very slowly in doing so. At the University of Illinois, I led the development of the Center for the Urban Resilience and Environmental Sustainability Cures, which is still going on. It's got over 100 scientists, social scientists, humanities, other experts involved in it, that can look at cities in all different ways. And one of the things we're trying to do is how do we look at this process of taking climate change analyses all the way to solutions and helping cities like those in the Chicago region to be able to get to the right solutions that will benefit them, including things like nature-based solutions. And Francine can certainly talk a lot more about that. I'm also going to be working a lot on nature-based solutions in the next year. We did help the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus and CMAP look at the 2021 Climate Action Plan for the Chicago region, and it's another report that I recommend you all look at if you haven't, that talks of how we can get to that next level of being more sustainable and resilient to these changes happening in our climate system. The Chicago region is itself a major emitter of these greenhouse gases and particles, largely through its use of transportation and energy. Some contribution from waste, but it can also be a major contributor to solution. And what the graph on the right shows is basically out of the Chicago Region Climate Action, the Chicago Region Climate Action Plan is, how do we get to the pathway of getting to those net zero emissions by 2050? Well, we haven't fully figured that out, but there's various ways that people are looking at that in terms of how you deal with energy, water, waste, and transportation in the Chicago area towards achieving that goal. Now, all these things I'm talking about, I'm sure Francine has things to offer as well, and I'll let her do that in a few minutes. When we did the Great Lakes assessment, we came up with a set of ways that solutions could happen as well, very much along the pathway I just mentioned. So we can accelerate the development of renewable energy, develop more decentralized electrical system based on more distributed renewable energy, such as the kind of solar system I have in my own house. Accelerate the implementation of energy efficiency, and accelerate adoption of electric and other renewable energy vehicles, so that we essentially take energy and transportation towards that net zero source of emissions of carbon dioxide and methane, et cetera. A couple of years ago, Roy is a economist from Springfield, and I did a little report on what if we had a carbon tax and then gave all the money back to the people, and redistributed such a way it was evenly distributed rather than any kind of other political approach, and would that be beneficial? And Roy's analysis suggests it would be, and would help promote the acceleration to more clean energy economy through this carbon fee and dividend approach. Since then, Francine has come in and worked with us in further expanding this to not only look at the US, but look even globally. And so several things have developed, and she can speak a lot better to these than I can, but helping forming a global climate compact of nations committed to mitigating climate change, for example, and ensuring climate finance to developing countries to assist in their clean energy transition. Now, some of the other solutions we did in the Great Lakes assessment would also look at things like the Great Lakes themselves, making sure the restoration initiative is funded, which has now retained its funding at this point. Limiting things like runoff that are leading to phosphorus pollution and causing many issues with algae blooms right now, mostly in Lake Erie, but I think we're going to see that as the lakes get warmer, expanding into the other lakes, more in Lake Michigan than we've had in the past. And so it's something that we need to continue to think about. We need to design, develop, and install green infrastructure, wetland restoration, permeable pavement, all those kind of things can help reduce how much undesired types of runoff are going into the lakes, and develop nature-based solutions for urban climate issues that we've already talked about. Now, Greenleaf has been actively involved in looking at water issues in the Great Lakes region. This is, again, something Francine can speak to more than I can, but I was part of a letter in Crane's Chicago Business that looked at the Chicago area of water challenges, and that we need to kind of change the approach that we're doing. Instead of everybody looking at water issues all by themselves, we really need to look at it collectively. So the one water solution concept is towards, how do we look at the issue in a more comprehensive way? Well, I always get asked, what can we do? We can each be the difference. There's much we can do. I think the single most important thing, I think, is communicate. Speak up, contact your representatives in Congress and the state of Illinois and the Chicago region about climate change is really important, and it's going to matter to us. It's going to matter to our children, our grandchildren. We need to be doing something about this to be more resilient and to reduce those emissions that are going to drive even larger changes. So we need to vote with care. We need to think about this in many different ways and influence others. We can also do a lot about being more energy efficient ourselves, and there's many different ways of doing that. I'll leave that all to you to discuss further. I do want to leave you with a sense of hope. Climate change is pretty depressing, and I recognize that. Our future does depend on how we act to limit climate change, and we also need to be resilient. Adaptation is not a choice. Our choice is whether to adapt proactively or just respond to the consequences of major events when they happen. I think we need to be proactive. However, I do also think we can draw on our long history of responding to changing conditions on our planet and facing the challenges of climate change. And I'll leave you with one final quote from the IPCC assessment, that the climate we experience in the future depends on our decisions now. Thank you. And I'll turn it over now to Francine.
All right, thank you, Don. Thank you very much for this this great presentation and a very comprehensive overview of the climate science. There are some pretty shocking facts in your presentation. I took some notes: the highest CO2 levels in millions of years, the fastest sea level rise in 3,000 years, the fact that climate change is going to exacerbate many existing stresses on ecosystems. And I'm thinking of things like algae blooms that we don't necessarily always associate with climate change, maybe more with contamination. But yeah, these are all problems that are also going to get worse with climate change. And you also made an interesting point on this idea of the average increase. We're talking about how much the Earth has warmed so far, but that's an average, and land masses have actually warmed more, and different parts of the planet have warmed more than that. And as Grace mentioned at the beginning, I'm now living in Switzerland. I was living in Chicago until last summer, so it's nice to be with all of you in the North Shore. Yeah, I recently learned that Switzerland actually warmed already more than 2 degrees Celsius. So I was quite shocked to learn about that, and very worried about the snow on top of the beautiful Swiss mountains. You also mentioned something about the cost of climate change, and I think we hear a lot all the time about, with all these policy discussions, we hear about what it's going to cost to address climate change, and I think we talk a lot less about what climate change is actually already costing us, costing taxpayers. So I think that's a very important point. And you also said something about nature-based solutions, so I was happy to hear that, and to hear that you're going to be working more on that. So we should definitely talk about that. Yeah, I think nature-based solutions are very interesting because they can actually address many issues at once. So of course they're sequestering carbon potentially, and so that helps mitigate climate change, but they can also help prevent floods. They support biodiversity. They increase well-being. And I think a lot of the challenges around these nature-based solutions is how can we best implement them and scale them. And that's something that I think has to do a lot with governance. So looking at how communities, how municipalities, what they can do to make sure that it actually gets done. I think we're understanding the science more and more, and what needs to be done, but actually getting it done is often very tricky. And so I'm happy to also talk more about that in the later questions. But it's very impressive. You've been involved in climate assessments from the global level to the more local level with the Great Lakes and the recent Illinois climate assessment. And you've done also a lot of research and other work, policy work in the greater Chicago region with local partners like Cures that you mentioned, and Greenleaf communities, of course, and many others. And I'm one of the lucky people who's worked with you over the last few years, including on climate policy. And you mentioned the climate policy work. So that's just a comment about that. That report was vetted by economists from leading think tanks around the country, like the Environmental Defense Fund, for example. And we shared that with hundreds of members of Congress, and we had many good conversations with them. And yeah, so I just like to emphasize again that putting a price on carbon, it's not the only thing that we should do, but it's definitely the most effective way for society to switch off fossil fuels. And it can be done in a way that's, that does not burden already vulnerable communities. And I think that's really one of the key messages of the report. And in fact, the US and Australia are the two only developed countries that have not yet implemented a national level carbon price. And you also mentioned the work that we've done on the Greater Chicago's regional water challenges. And our region is very unique because of the abundance of fresh water, but also because of the many water-related challenges that it faces, despite Lake Michigan. So we have communities that actually don't have access to water. A lot of issues of stormwater flooding, of course, fluctuating lake levels, which you mentioned, and erosion. And as you said, it's very important for communities and for the decision makers in across the region to work together to address these challenges, these common challenges. But so let me ask you a couple of questions. So you explained that climate change is a global phenomenon that has very local impacts. A lot of extreme weather, floods, extreme heat, droughts. So how can we better plan for the uncertainty of climate change at the local level? And especially, how can Chicago's North Shore prepare for the specific impacts that climate change will have on their communities? And I know that you've done quite some work recently on downscaling techniques. So maybe that's something that you can talk about a little bit. I think that ties in well with this idea of better understanding the local climate impact. So maybe without getting into the very difficult details, I think that would be something interesting to, So please go ahead.
So I've been aiming my research recently directly at that question. How do we go from global down to local and get the right information to help communities deal with this issue? And that's part of the reasons why I put the cures slide in there, was to show that we're trying to do that. So if we look at the greater Chicago region, or even tune in even more to the North Shore, we want to make sure we have the right climate information at exactly that level. And so we're trying to develop tools which are called downscaling tools. I have a book that came out in the last year that looks at the whole question of downscaling. If anyone's interested, it's available through Cambridge University Press. And in that, those techniques allow us to take those global model results that are basically on a 100-kilometer spatial time scale, or spatial scale, to down to a few kilometers. And that allows us then to look at climate change much more locally and try to understand those kind of impacts. Then we want to build on top of that GIS information system kind of capabilities, that geographical information system that allows us to really look at the local region. Where are the areas that are most likely to have the tendencies at the highest risk, and can we deal with trying to come up with nature-based or other solutions that can help that community deal with what they're going to face. Mitigation and adaptation are always part of the same issue, so you want to look at that as well, but adaptation is at the community level is particularly what's going to be relevant.
Thanks. That was very, very insightful, and I think very important work. And I know that we're a little bit short on time, so I think I'll just ask you one more question before we turn it over back to Grace. So you touched on that idea of all this doom and gloom and the importance of maintaining hope. And I was wondering if there's anything that gives you hope that we can still come together as a global community and address climate change. And I know that you have worked in the past on international agreements to fix the hole in the ozone layer, and maybe that's also something that if you see any links with climate change, if you think that there's a possibility for more international coordination.
I went into COP26 thinking that it probably would not achieve the goals that everyone set of getting to 1.5 degrees. I just knew based on past experience and the combination of assessments and then how countries respond to that. For ozone, it was what's called the Montreal Protocol, and follows a very similar line of things. But what we did there is we kept strengthening as more and more science was understood. And I think right now we know enough science to get the right climate policy together. We kept strengthening what that assessment demanded. And I think we just got to get the countries together and be stronger about this, that we all have to make a decision. And it's going to involve a little suffering on the part of the world to be able to make that transition. But I think we also have those solutions at hand. We know how to transition our energy. We know how to transition our transportation. We just got to want to do it and make it happen. And I think we can do it. It's just, can we do it soon enough? I think that's the big issue.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I agree with that final message. I think that we can do it, and we have to do it fast. And
by the way, I'm happy to answer more questions if people want to keep going, but I understand they may want to cut this off at 2 o'clock too.
Yes, I hope that we have a little bit more time, and I'll hand it back to Grace now. I think there are many other questions to answer, and I think there will be some more discussion by John also on the local level. So back to you, Grace.
Yes, hi. Thank you. Thank you both very much for sharing your knowledge on this incredibly critical topic. A great deal of information has been packed into this presentation, and I'd like to remind the viewers that the entire slide deck will be emailed to you in a day or two so that you can look at the slides more closely. There's a lot to learn, and you can do it at your own speed, and also share them, please. We all have plenty to do in terms of speaking up, spreading the word, and that can be part of it. We'll also be, with that same email, we'll be sending you the link to the video recording of this program and a slew of links to additional resources, including some of the ones that were mentioned here today. Now we'll move on to questions. We have a few minutes left, and I'll ask as many as we have time for. There are a lot of them out there. We're also being joined now by John Anderson. He is going to discuss a few solutions for the North Shore, and he's going to address any North Shore specific questions that you may have. John Anderson is the president of Greenleaf Communities and the founder and president of Greenleaf Advisors, LLC, which advises businesses, institutions, and communities on strategies that advance their sustainable development. Welcome.
Thank you, Grace. Nice to be with you. If we have time, I'll give you just a couple quick comments. Don, great presentation. Thanks for being on our board at Greenleaf, guiding our work. There are many things that we can do on the North Shore to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Integrating green infrastructure in land use plans helps to manage water flows and mitigate climate effects. And as you know, Chicago is ringed by a network of green infrastructure that needs protection and restoration. It can be enhanced through community landscape plans and ordinances that promote native plantings and local solutions, as are shown here. David Yak is chair of North America's Green Infrastructure Foundation, with whom I work, and he promotes the following, which I've quoted on the slide. Living ecologies that function cooperatively with technology to optimize the performance of an entire system, balance water, carbon cycling, energy, and nutrients locally. That's how we're going to achieve our results. Integrated solutions that help improve well-being and environmental quality in the short term, but also increasing resiliency to climate change in the long term. Let's take a look at some intelligently managed systems. The next slide is going to show us stormwater systems that are being managed to mitigate flooding in the city of Albany. They build resiliency through what's called a continuous monitoring and adaptive control system managed by Opti technology, and that can be deployed here as well. They do it through a cloud-based software system that manages both gray and green storage assets and conveyance systems. And in this case, mitigate 90% of stormwater overflows at a fraction of the cost of alternatives. So I'd like to see us putting this more into practice here in Northern Illinois. Next slide. Similarly, on energy systems, smart solar coupled with energy storage can optimize the economics and operational performance, as demonstrated by Apt Electronics right here in Glenview. Its rooftop PV and Tesla batteries are managed by intelligent generation, delivering a stack of values that include reduction of peak loads during expensive hours, as well as lucrative grid stabilization services that are known as frequency regulation. This smart system provides backup power to the largest retail store in the country. Municipalities and enterprises in the North Shore can pursue this solution as well. And the recently passed Clean Energy Jobs Act in Illinois, CEJA, offers significant incentives to do so. So the world's moving rapidly toward intelligently managed network solutions on energy and water, and it includes nature-based solutions. North Shore communities can lead at the local level where change really happens and get scaled up to make a broader impact. These solutions will accelerate if we have supportive policies both at the state and national levels, including putting a price on carbon that Don and Francine have mentioned. And as an old economist and having now worked through this initiative with hundreds of them, it's uniform message. Put a price on something if you want to accelerate a whole of society shift. You can find more on information on these solutions and many others on the Greenleaf websites. Grace, back to you, and back to Dr. Wuebbles for excellent Q&A session. Don's got a lot to share with us. Thank you, Don.
Thank you, John. I want those slides.
Well, we all want all of yours too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with just a couple of the questions that were submitted in advance. There is a question from Jane who says, in your opinion, what are some of the best organizations for us to join to amplify our voices on the dire need for real climate action?
Yeah, I'm so busy doing the science. I'm not aware of all the organizations. I'm heavily involved with the Nature Conservancy. I know they are picking that up. They've asked me to be on their board of trustees for the Illinois section. And actually one of my former students is just a few months ago became the lead scientist for the Nature Conservancy. So I know they're moving heavily into climate. And I think many of the other sustainability, resiliency, environmental, ecological kind of organizations around the world have all moved heavily in that direction. And I think that's even going to be more so. So I think there's a large number of possibilities, and I'm probably a poor choice because I concentrate so much on the science. I'm not one to heavily get involved unless people ask me to, because I'm just already doing so many things.
Well, Don, maybe I'll add to your comment because it's actually what we do at Greenleaf. We work across the scientific community, but also the business and the investment communities, and the governmental communities on critical issues. Climate change is our priority. So at a local level, I would encourage you to consider, well, I'm right here in Wilmette, Go Green Wilmette, terrific, okay? Go Green Illinois, great network of local solutions. You've heard Metropolitan Mayor Caucus earlier. Those that are with our municipalities, most are signed up, but all need to sign up with Edith Markra there and her great leadership on guiding the cities. And the organizations just get nested at higher levels. So we have these networks of cities, networks of community organizations, and then of course the environmental organizations. I used to be the director of the Great Lakes program for the Nature Conservancy. So work with all of the NGOs, okay? And then, Francine, we've been working with all the economists and as well the investors. So I would just offer on this question, Katie DeMuro, who's on the line here, we can share with people interests in what are these interrelated networks of folks that are committed to climate mitigation adaptation, depending upon what scale and what interest area you have.
And just to jump in quickly here, we've had a lot of comments on Citizens Climate Lobby, and Francine has reached out to them. So thank you for those. We can share others that we've shared the climate policy work with as well.
Yeah,
CCL
is a great leader and has been for decades, as is the Climate Leadership Council, which is really a organization of corporates and governments and universities, and we could go on from there. So we will share with you our network of networks. Next question.
Thank you. This is probably a question more for Francine. Can you give a few examples of nature-based solutions?
Sure, of course. So yeah, nature-based solutions, it's a very broad term that's referring to protecting or restoring or even creating, protecting and restoring the natural capital that we already have, and then also adding this natural capital maybe where we don't have it yet. It can be concretely anything from parks, urban parks, for example, the trees in a city, but also things like green roofs and green walls. So it can be from the very small scale to much larger scale, sort of green infrastructure. Also blue infrastructure, so also protecting local rivers and ponds. And the idea with this is, so I mentioned a little bit in my comments, nature-based solutions really can have multiple benefits, and that's also why they can be a challenge to implement. But they can have benefits for climate change, so carbon sequestration and improving air quality through, for example, through more trees in cities. But the green space can also help mitigate flooding. So that means that you would need to have less gray infrastructure if you can have enough green spaces to compensate for that. It can improve water quality. It also has a lot of benefits for well-being, so and really health impacts. So there are studies showing that people live longer if they're living close to greener areas. So yeah, the list of benefits is long, but yeah, the challenge is. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just the kind of extreme events I was talking about, where extreme temperatures or extreme rainfall. There are a number of nature-based solutions for dealing with those that, if implemented, can help make the area more resilient.
And I'm sure, Francine, your work with the United Nations report has references in there we can make available to people. And also the research you did that we were going to apply in Northern Illinois, bringing examples from 4 cities around the world on this subject. Just didn't get funding for the project yet, but Francine can stream in those solutions internationally to people that have an interest. Also on the chat, somebody mentioned Drawdown and John Foley. Dr. Foley keynoted one of our climate presentations, Don, I think right with you. And Drawdown, if you haven't gone there, has 100 of the top solutions to climate change, and we're working on 23 of them, I think. So they're all there. It's very available. Just Google John Foley, Foley Drawdown, and you'll see a list of solutions you can apply, in your own area.
Grace, you're on mute.
Sorry, this is a question probably for Dr. Wuebbles. Vera would like to know, do you think that new or developing technologies, for example, CCS, have a role to play in mitigating climate change? Can we put our trust in giant vacuums up in the sky that take the carbon out?
So there's multiple different types of geoengineering approaches that could be used, either to respond to the warming to kind of cool the atmosphere. I'm pretty much opposed to those until we've done more research on them. The problem with the taking carbon out of the atmosphere is it's a big atmosphere, and it's very, very expensive financially to be able to take enough carbon out to really matter. So there are experiments going on, such as the one in Iceland going on right now, where they are removing carbon, but it's at a very low scale. And if you want to actually look at what it would take to take such a thing globally to really make a difference in the carbon cycle, you'd find pretty quickly that it's prohibitively expensive. And that's the problem.
Thank you. Here's a question for hyperlocal, down to the individuals. Alex wants to know, what's one change that we can make in our daily lives that would have the most impact on curbing climate change? Anyone?
Well, I had a whole list of things about, look at your own household and how you use your vehicles, et cetera, or what vehicles you use. And you can certainly look at how you be more efficient. That makes a difference. But as I would still say, the most important thing you can do is to be vocal and communicate. And that's where we can really, try to get a real decision happening across our nation and across all the different nations.
Yeah, I would add adopting new activities and then sharing solutions with your neighbors. That's how things spread. So being efficient in your building, my next car will be an electric car. It'll have a battery. I'm going to connect it to my house and use that. The batteries are being designed as backup power for homes now in electric vehicles. So, and think about your boiler system shifting from gas to electric, so on and so forth. I mean, as we change things out, there are incentives behind that. And as you share the success in your home with your neighbors, they will do it. Beth Drucker asked me to share something here too. And this is important. I was also an environmental commissioner in Wilmette, loved that experience from maybe 8 years. And there are many other commissions in the North Shore and other sustainability groups, task force that advise their councils, Glencoe and so forth. I encourage everybody to join those, participate, and inform your council members as they make decisions on your investments to be smarter and resilient, and climate friendly. So we can have a big impact, by the way, in terms of our local voice, and encouraging ordinances in our towns to shift plantings toward those great oak trees, that harbor an abundance of biodiversity. And I got to commend Glencoe for putting on Douglas Ptolemy. I read 3 of his books before he came out and spoke about the magic of oaks and how they harbor all kinds of insects that feed the birds that I love so much. But the non-native plants and trees don't do that. So we really have to do that in our backyards, but also in our public parks and in our ordinances to encourage native plantings. That's how we will improve healthy soil, which Katie DeMiro works on a lot in the ag community, as you know, Don. It's the same thing in agriculture as it is in our backyards. It's about healthy soils to mitigate climate change. There's a lot on our Greenleaf Communities website on that.
And I would just like to echo also some of what Don said, and John also mentioned that. So of course, be vocal and reach out to your local representatives and your community, but also there's a lot of evidence that people are most likely to change their behavior because they got information from people really close to them. So also don't forget to talk to your family members and to your friends. That's for most people how they will actually really make a change in their lives.
Thank you.
We're eating more plant-based burgers around here. And one of our board members, we're fortunate to have experts in climate, soil, water on Greenleaf's board, including, Brian Richter was the global head of TNC's water. His sustainable water program is a leader on water efficiency. His study on how our burgers that we ate here affect the exasperated water supply that's being depleted in the West is unbelievable. It's all about the supply chain. What we eat has a major impact on our water resources and our climate. So yeah, I'm delighted that they're more vegetarian-based burgers because I still like the taste of a burger. You can make a change just by eating veggie burgers.
Well, we're at the 1 hour 15-minute mark, so I'm afraid we're going to have to close down the discussion at this point so that Dr. Wuebbles, who is working on 3 papers right now, can get back to his other duties. Thank you all.
My postdocs, yeah.
Thank you all for sharing your time so generously, and I urge everyone who watching to please keep up the good fight. Speak up, spread the word, vote carefully, and get involved, and watch for the library's email for suggestions on that.
If people do have other questions and they really need an answer, just send me an email. Happy to help.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to
all.
Glencoe and your leadership. You've got great leadership in the library, but also on your council. It's a great town. Thanks for having us here.
Okay. Thanks very much, everybody. So long.
Thank you so much.